You stand on a hillside where the mist clings low, curling around your legs like something alive. The air smells of wet leaves and cold soil. There is no wind, no birdsong, only the soft crunch of your steps. Beneath that thin skin of earth under your boots, something waits. Not gold, not treasure, but bones. Dozens, no, hundreds. Some lie twisted as if frozen mid-flight. Some are headless, others curled tightly around smaller skeletons, arms still wrapped around what might have been children. There are no markers, no stones, no carved names. Just silence, as if the ground itself refuses to speak. You don't know their faces. You never will. And yet, part of you recognizes them. Not because you've seen them before, but because your body remembers. Somewhere in the long, winding story of your blood, a man stood here, or somewhere like here. One of your ancestors. He lived, but almost no one else did. Around 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, something happened. Something so vast and invisible that it left no written record because writing didn't exist yet. But it carved its mark in the only archive that could survive this long: DNA. In the male line, in the Y chromosome you carry from your father, from his father, and so on without break for thousands of years, there is a gap, a chasm, a cliff in history. It's called a bottleneck, a collapse so sharp that it erased nearly every male lineage on Earth. In genetic terms, it's as if there were once 20 different voices speaking in the choir of humanity's Y chromosome, and then, almost overnight, 19 fell silent. Only one remained singing, and that one is yours. Not metaphorically, statistically. We know because when scientists mapped the genetic diversity of men alive today, they found an impossible pattern, a sudden global near erasure of male variety. Women's genetic lines? Still broad and varied, their mitochondrial DNA weaving a rich tapestry of ancestry. But for men, the Y chromosome was hammered into a narrow funnel, and almost every branch that once existed was cut. The question is, how and why? Was it nature's doing, a plague, a famine, a shifting climate, or was it human hands? Did our ancestors look each other in the eye across a valley like this one and decide only one group would live to tell the story? You close your eyes and imagine it. No stone cities, no kings or armies in gleaming armor. Only scattered villages, crude tools, and people who lived and died without ever seeing a map of their world. Yet something about the way they fought, killed, or simply chose who could reproduce changed the trajectory of every man alive. You is still quiet. But now, the silence feels heavier. Beneath your feet lies not just death, but the opening chapter of a story almost no one knows. A story written not in ink, but in bone and bloodlines. And it begins here, in the shadow of something that almost erased half of humanity. You take a step forward, but the scene around you starts to dissolve. The mist and grass fade into white walls, humming machines, and the cool sterility of a modern genetics lab. It smells faintly of ethanol and plastic. Somewhere nearby, a soft click, click, click of a keyboard echoes like distant footsteps in a cave. Here, the past isn't dug up with shovels, it's decoded. In glass tubes and blinking servers, your ancestors' story has been stripped down to a chemical script, each letter of DNA like an ancient rune waiting to be read. Scientists sit hunched over monitors, scrolling through maps of the human genome as if they're star charts, looking for patterns that no one alive remembers. In the very center of that genetic universe is one of the smallest, strangest pieces of code we carry: the Y chromosome. If your DNA were a vast library, the Y chromosome would be a single fragile scroll in a locked cabinet. It doesn't change much. It doesn't trade paragraphs with other chromosomes the way most do. From father to son, it's passed almost exactly intact, like a whispered secret that must never be altered. But somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago, that whisper nearly stopped. Not faded, stopped. When scientists first compared Y chromosomes from men across the world, they expected variety, hundreds, even thousands of distinct lineages surviving from prehistory. That's what they saw in women's mitochondrial DNA, a wide, rich web of ancestry stretching back for tens of thousands of years. But for men, the web wasn't a web anymore. It was a single thread, a bottleneck so sharp it looked like a cliff in the data. Imagine a library of 20 books, each telling a different family's male story. One day, all but one are burned. The lone surviving book is copied, over and over for thousands of years. Every man alive today is reading a version of that same book. The female lines? Still intact, still richly diverse. Which means whatever happened wasn't a plague that killed everyone. It wasn't an asteroid or a sudden ice age. Women kept living, kept passing on their genes, but almost every man vanished from the record. The data is so stark it makes your scalp prickle, because if women survived and only men disappeared, that points to something selective, intentional, human. The scientists give it a clean, clinical name, the Y chromosome bottleneck. But when you strip away the jargon, it's something far darker. A moment in our past when the male half of humanity was almost entirely wiped out. No one wrote it down. Until Minran, don't send something more. That's where so far. I meted in tear life in those trees last, scattered across continents. It's not just the scale, it's the feed. The male lines didn't dwindle, they collapsed. If it had been a natural disaster, an earthquake, a tsunami, a volcanic winter, men and women would have been erased together. The female mitochondrial DNA would show the same sharp drop, but it doesn't. The woman's forest kept growing, unchanged. That's the first chilling clue. This wasn't the earth killing men. This was people killing men. Scientists hesitate to put it so bluntly. They speak of population replacement events and patrilineal lineage constriction that strip away the careful words and the meaning is bare. For generation after generation, men from certain groups simply stopped having sons. And when you stop having sons, your Y chromosome stops moving forward. In the genetic record, it's as if you never existed. You imagine one of those lost men, strong hands, dark eyes, a life lived entirely before writing or cities. He hunts, he laughs, he loves. He may even survive whatever violence sweeps his village, but if he leave no sons, history takes his name, his blood, his every trace, and buries it deeper than any grave. That's how fast it can happen. 2 or 3 generations of deliberate exclusion, whether by death or social design, and an entire lineage vanishes. And when this happened, it didn't happen in one valley or one kingdom. It happened everywhere. The data shows the cliff on every continent where people lived, as if across the whole human world someone had decided the same thing. Some men could stay, most could not. Why? Power, land, survival? Or was it something older and colder? An instinct buried deep in us, one that turns strangers into enemies when resources run thin. The Y lines stopped once, a long time ago, but what they left behind is still here, walking, breathing, and wandering at the edge of the forest of bones. The deeper scientists dig, the more the data stops looking like more random, but this is selective, like a hunter choosing which trees to fell in a forest, leaving the rest to grow. Archaeologists start to connect the dots. Mass graves with only certain kinds of victims, villages where the pattern repeats, adult men gone, women and children left alive, or taken. It's almost too neat. If you were trying to erase a people without destroying the land or the women, you do exactly this. And here's the cruel genius of it. You don't have to kill everyone. Wipe out enough men of fighting age, control who the women have children with, and in just 2 or 3 generations, the genetic footprint of your rivals is gone. No siege, no endless war, just surgical, efficient removal. This is the part that makes the back of your neck prickle, because the pattern is not only prehistoric. It will echo in later centuries, in the scorched villages of Genghis Khan's conquests, in tribal raids where women are spared but men are slaughtered, in modern conflicts where population replacement is still whispered about as a strategy. But here, in the deep past, it's pure, raw. No kings ordering armies from a palace, just clan against clan, group against group. The decision is made in a smoky hut or around a fire. They go, we stay. And with that, the future bends. This wasn't an accident. This was a system, one that may have lasted for centuries. And the proof is written not in ink or stone, but in the Y chromosome that carried your life forward, while almost every other branch was cut. The clean, white sterility of the genetics lab fades away, replaced by the grit and sweat of an archaeological dig. The air is warmer here, drier, and filled with the dusty scent of freshly turned soil. A low sun spills long shadows across the pit, where figures in wide-brimmed hats crouch over the ground with brushes, trowels, and the patience of saints. This is where the silent data of DNA meets the solid evidence of history, where the bones in the earth speak for themselves. But what they say is not gentle. You look down into a rectangular cut in the hillside, the Talheim death pit in Germany. Inside, skeletons lie jumbled, tangled together like sticks thrown into a heap. The skull of a young man bears a clean, round hole, the mark of a stone axe swung with deliberate force. Another skeleton is slumped forward, arms twisted behind his back in the last pose of restraint. There are women here, too, and children, but the adult men dominate the count. The violence is personal. Broken noses, fractured jaws, deep cuts in bone. No battlefield, no warriors' graves. This was a village, and someone came for them. Talheim isn't alone. Travel a few hundred miles and a few centuries becomes even stranger. Bones deliberately broken, skulls smashed, some cut marks suggesting defleshing, maybe even cannibalism. Not random acts of rage, but ritualized violence. The more sites you visit in your mind, the clearer the picture becomes. These weren't skirmishes between equally armed warriors. They were raids, swift, decisive strikes meant to cripple a rival community. Kill the men who can fight, take the women who can bear children, and leave the rest to rot. Every shovel of soil confirms what the genetic record already whispered. This wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a habit, a way of life, and it didn't happen in just one place. Across Europe, across Asia, even into Africa, similar graves appear, all from the same window of time, the very centuries when the Y chromosome bottleneck tightened around the throat of male diversity. Standing on the edge of a pit like Talheim, you can almost feel it, the heat of that day, the shouts, the chaos, the final silence. You realize the people in that pit weren't just unlucky. They were targets in a long, invisible war, one that left no written record, but whose outcome still shapes the faces and names walking the earth today. Picture a time before the massacre pits, before villages were turned into hunting grounds for other humans. The world was still open then. People moved with the seasons, following herds, gathering fruits, digging roots. If land grew barren, they simply walked away. No fences, no borders, no fixed claim over a patch of soil. Then came the seeds. Around 10,000 years ago, somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, someone dropped a grain into the earth, not to eat it, but to make it grow again. The shift was quiet, almost invisible at first, but it changed everything. Farming didn't just create food, it created place. You couldn't chase herds if your harvest was rooted in one field. You couldn't abandon your home if your year's survival was buried in its soil. The rhythms of life shifted from the wandering heartbeat of the wild to the measured tick of planting and harvest. With that shift came something humans had never truly experienced before: ownership. A field wasn't just dirt anymore. It was the difference between eating through the winter or starving before spring. It became worth protecting, worth fighting for, and unlike a herd, which could be hunted by anyone, farmland was fixed. That meant if you wanted more of it, you had to take it, and to keep it, you had to defend it. Farming also created surplus. Stored grain meant wealth, and wealth meant inequality. Some people began to have more than others: more food, more tools, more land. And with inequality came envy, ambition, and the first sparks of organized violence. It was no longer enough to survive. People began to think in terms of control. The earliest farmers built permanent homes. Homes turned into villages. Villages became territories, meant enemies. And in a world where survival depended on how many hands could plant and harvest, a neighboring group wasn't just competition. It was a threat to your life and the lives of your children. Now imagine the mind of an early farming leader staring across a narrow river at another settlement. Your land is too small, your stores are too thin. You could try to trade, but trade takes trust, and trust is fragile when your own people are hungry. Or you could take their land. But to take their land, you have to take them. This was the first real seed of the Y chromosome bottleneck, planted not in hatred, but in cold arithmetic. The land fed your people, but the men across the river stood in the way. And from that moment, the logic of violence began to change forever. When we think of war today, we imagine politics, revenge, or ideology. But in the earliest days of farming, war often had none of these things. It was simpler, and in a way, colder. You didn't need to hate the people across the field. You didn't even need to know their names. All you needed to know was this: if your harvest failed, your children would starve. And if theirs succeeded, they had the food you needed. Early raids were not epic battles between vast armies. They were sudden, calculated strikes. A group slipping through the night, attacking at dawn, striking only until the balance of survival tipped in their favor, and then leaving. It wasn't about destroying every living soul. That would be a waste of energy. It was about removing enough of the opposing group's strength so they could never strike back, and crucially, so they could no longer pass their lineage into the future. This is where the bottleneck's dark logic reveals itself. You don't have to erase a people's memory to erase their genetic signature. You only have to remove the men who can carry their Y chromosome forward. Without sons, a lineage disappears as completely as if it had been burned from history. The rest was efficiency. Women were rarely killed. They were absorbed, taken into the victor's group, given new names, speaking new words. Their children would carry the victor's blood, not their old families. From the perspective of those doing it, this wasn't cruelty. It was problem-solving, a resource transfer. You could increase your group's labor force, expand your gene pool, and secure more food, all in a single calculated act. And because it wasn't driven by personal hatred, it could happen again and again, without the emotional fatigue that vengeance brings. Violence became a renewable tool, just another way to manage risk in a fragile, unpredictable world. This perhaps is the most unsettling part. Hatred burns itself out. Survival never does. The raids, the killings, the quiet absorption of survivors, they didn't just change the size of a group. Over time, they changed its very structure. In the beginning, some early farming communities still followed loose, flexible family lines. A child's identity might come from their mother's clan or a mix of both parents. But as agriculture deepened its roots, one system began to dominate. Patrilineal descent, tracing family, inheritance, and power strictly through the male line. It made sense in a world built on land. Land was now the foundation of survival, and land was passed from father to son. Women could marry into the group, but the men were its anchors, the ones whose blood defined ownership. Under patrilineal rules, a man's sons weren't just his children. They were his claim on the earth itself. And if you could remove a rival's sons, you didn't just weaken his household. You erased his future claim to his fields, his tools, his animals. In the eyes of the community, without a male heir, his legacy dissolved like smoke. Suddenly, the logic of killing rival men wasn't just about immediate survival, it was about controlling the future. A cleared field wasn't enough, you had to clear the bloodlines that might come back to reclaim it. The more this system spread, the more it fed the Y chromosome bottleneck. In a patrilineal world, the Y chromosome was the key to identity, power, and property. Remove enough of them, and you reshape the entire social map, not just for a year or a decade, but for generations. And so, villages became clans. Clans became lineages. Blood ties hardened into walls as real as stone. Outside those walls, every man was a potential enemy, every Y chromosome a rival stake in the ground. If you could step back and see the map of humanity at this time, it would look like a shifting mosaic of male lines expanding, colliding, and consuming each other, each expansion leaving less diversity behind. The bottleneck wasn't just an accident of history. It was the natural outcome of a world where survival was written in fathers and sons. In this new patrilineal world, women were no longer simply members of their birth community. They became bridges, living links between once rival groups. When a raid succeeded and the men were gone, women were often spared. Not out of mercy, but out of calculation. They were the bearers of the next generation, the vessels through which the victor's bloodlines could expand. The woman taken from her village might never see her home again. Her language could vanish from her tongue within a generation. The songs she learned as a girl might fade into fragments, unrecognizable to her children. And yet, in her body, she carried the ability to merge two worlds, though only one would be remembered. Genetically, this is why the mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, stayed rich and diverse during the bottleneck. Women's lineages were preserved, even if their identities were not. The Y chromosome diversity collapsed, but the female genetic map kept weaving its many threads across time. From the victor's perspective, the logic was simple. Kill the men to remove the rival Y chromosomes. But take the women to bear children who carry only the victor's Y chromosomes. Instagram just a few generations, the rival lineage disappears as if it never existed. This wasn't just violence. It was assimilation as a weapon, one of the oldest, most effective forms of conquest humanity has ever practiced. And it required no prisons, no chains, no guards. It was written into the intimate, unavoidable rhythms of family life. But for the women themselves, survival came with an unspoken price. Every child they bore was living proof of a lost lineage, and of a night, a raid, a moment they might never speak of aloud. It is no wonder that the memory of these events rarely survived in myths or oral histories. Such stories, if told at all, might be reshaped into tales of gods, heroes, and fated unions. Anything but the blunt truth of conquest in the dark. And yet, the genetic record remembers. It shows the sharp edge of a system where women with a thread that connected past to future, even as the patterns on that thread were being deliberately rewoven. If you strip away the emotion, the grief, the human faces, the Y chromosome bottleneck can be reduced to a kind of brutal arithmetic. And like all math, it is merciless. Imagine two neighboring groups. Each has 50 men and 50 women. After a raid, one group loses most of its men, say 45 of them. The women remain. In the next generation, almost every child will carry the Y chromosome of those 5 surviving men because the dead men's genetic line ends instantly. Now, imagine this happening again, and again, and again across centuries. In each cycle, the surviving Y chromosomes spread wider, while the erased ones are gone forever. The diversity narrows until eventually only a few male lineages dominate the entire region. Nature knows this pattern well. In many animal species, especially those with strong male competition, lions, gorillas, elephant seals, only a small number of males father most of the offspring. The rest leave no genetic trace. For humans in the Bottleneck era, war and social rules did the same job. Sometimes it didn't even require killing. A victorious clan could exile rival men, deny them the right to marry, or push them into dangerous, low-status roles that kept them from raising families. Death was the fastest way to erase a Y chromosome, but social exclusion could do it just as effectively, and with less blood on the ground. What makes the bottleneck so striking is its scale. In some regions, genetic studies suggest that as few as 1 in 20 men passed on their Y chromosome during those centuries. Everyone else's line, their father's name, their father's father's name, every male ancestor stretching back into the dark, ended. This is the logic of erasure. You control reproduction. The formation who met for a few generations. And if you do it across enough territory, you can reshape the future of an entire species. The haunting truth is that this strategy worked. So well that you, reading these words, are almost certainly descended from the small minority of men who survived it. Your Y chromosome, if you carry one, is the product of one of history's most ruthless filters. For the survivors, the war didn't end when the weapons fell silent. It followed them into every corner of their new lives. Imagine a woman taken from her village after the men were killed or driven away. She walks for days, guarded by strangers, into a settlement where every face is unfamiliar. The air smells different. The language bends in ways her tongue has never shaped before. She is given food, shelter, and a place to sleep, not as an honored guest, but as property, now woven into another family's story. The man she is told to marry is not someone she chose. His children will be her children, but they will not carry her father's name, her brother's bloodline, or the songs of her people. Her world is not entirely cruel. She might grow to respect or even care for her new family. The rhythms of planting, harvesting, and raising children bind her into the life of the victors. But beneath that surface, a quiet truth remains. Every child she bears is proof that her old lineage is gone. For her daughters, the change is gentler. They grow up speaking the language of the victors, learning the customs of the clan that took their mother in. They may never even know they are the children of two worlds. For her sons, however, there is no ambiguity. Their Y chromosome comes from the man who conquered their mother's people. When they grow, they will marry within the victor's clan or another allied group, pushing their biological inheritance further into the future, while their maternal grandfather's line ends in silence. This is how the bottleneck worked without endless slaughter. Once women were absorbed, their descendants carried only the victor's Y chromosomes. In just a few generations, the erased line was invisible in the paternal record, living only on the unspoken stories of mothers and grandmothers. Perhaps a few whispered those stories by the fire at night, passing them to daughters who could keep the memory alive. But memories fade, and by the time a few centuries had passed, whole peoples existed only in the mitochondrial DNA of women who never forgot, and in the soil where their brothers and fathers lay buried. In the cold language of genetics, this was success. In human terms, it was a quiet extinction. The Y chromosome bottleneck didn't just wipe out men, it erased worlds. Every lineage carried more than DNA. It carried a language, shaped by centuries of shared jokes, lullabies, and whispered warnings. It carried rituals, the way a family buried its dead, the songs they sang at planting, the stories they told to explain the stars.
When the men were gone and the women absorbed into another clan, those cultural threads began to fray. The children learned the victor's tongue, prayed to the victor's gods, and followed the victor's rules. Within a generation or two, the customs of their mother's people became strange relics, half forgotten, or reinterpreted to fit the new order. Archaeology catches faint echoes of this loss. A shift in pottery styles from one layer of soil to the next, sharper angles replacing round, or a different pattern of lines in the clay. Burial sites where the orientation of the body suddenly changes. Jewelry styles that vanish overnight, replaced by new shapes and materials. These are not the signs of gradual change. They are signatures of replacement. One group disappearing, another taking its place. What makes the disappearance so complete is that it happens on two levels at once. The men's Y chromosomes vanish from the genetic record. The women's mitochondrial DNA survives, but their culture does not. What remains is a biological trace without the story that once gave it meaning. If you could step into that moment in history, you might see a grandmother trying to teach her grandchild an old lullaby in a language the child barely understands. You might see her bury a charm under the threshold of the house, the last remnant of a superstition no one else in the village follows anymore. These fragments might survive for a while, but eventually they fade, swallowed by the dominant culture. To the victors, this was success. Not just land won, but rivals erased so completely that future generations might not even know they ever existed. To history, it's a silence. And to us, thousands of years later, it's a gap we can feel, but never truly fill. Agriculture didn't just change how people lived, it changed what they believed. When your survival depends on crops, the land itself becomes sacred. The first farmers didn't just plant seeds, they planted prayers. Grain wasn't merely food, it was life, stored and guarded like treasure. And when something is sacred, it can be used to justify almost anything. Across early farming cultures, gods and spirits began to take root alongside the fields. Fertility deities promised abundance if honored, drought if ignored. Rainfall was a blessing, blight a curse. In a world so precarious, people searched for patterns, for causes, for ways to keep the harvest coming, and sometimes those ways involved blood. In some villages, the act of killing an enemy was no longer just about removing a threat. It became an offering. A captured rival might be sacrificed to feed the soil, their death believed to ensure the next year's harvest. The grain gods demanded loyalty, and loyalty could be proven through violence. Archaeological evidence hints at these practices. At certain sites, the placement of human remains alongside storage pits suggests ritual killings linked to agriculture. In others, marks on bones indicate deliberate breaking or defleshing, perhaps as part of a ceremonial feast. Whether these were acts of reverence, intimidation, or both, they blurred the line between survival strategy and religious duty. Once violence is sanctified, it's easier to repeat. A raid against a neighboring settlement could be framed not just as self-defense or conquest, but as obedience to divine will. To kill the men and take the women was not only practical, it was holy. This fusion of agriculture, faith, and bloodshed may have been one of the forces that kept the Y chromosome bottleneck going for centuries. When your God blesses your victory and demands the elimination of your rivals, the logic of erasure becomes a sacred tradition. And like all traditions, it can outlive the moment that created it. In the southwest of modern-day Germany lies a site that has puzzled and unsettled archaeologists for decades: Herxheim. At first glance, it looks like the remains of an ordinary Neolithic village, but beneath the surface, the earth tells a very different story. Excavations have revealed long ditches filled not with garbage or rubble, but with human bones, hundreds of them. The remains date back to around 7,000 years ago, right in the heart of the Y chromosome bottleneck period, and they bear marks that speak of something far darker than natural death. Many of the skulls are fractured, some with the precision of a single deliberate blow.
Bones are disarticulated, separated from each other, and in many cases broken while still fresh. Some long bones appear to have been split open, possibly to extract marrow. There are cut marks consistent with defleshing. It's not just the violence that's striking, but the pattern. The placement of remains suggests ritual. Skulls and bones are arranged deliberately, sometimes grouped, sometimes aligned in specific orientations. This wasn't the chaos of a battlefield or the hurried burial of plague victims. This was methodical. Who were these people? The isotopic analysis of their teeth, a way to measure where someone grew up based on the minerals in their water and food, suggests they weren't all locals. Some came from far away. Were they captives taken in raids, allies brought here for a ceremonial death, or even members of the community chosen for a grim fate? The purpose of Herxheim is still debated. Some scholars believe it was a site of ritualized cannibalism, where killing and consuming the dead was a sacred act tied to beliefs about life, death, and renewal. Others argue it was a place of intimidation, a macabre warning to anyone who dared threaten the settlement. Either way, Herxheim shows us how violence could be transformed into something more than strategy. Here, it was performance, ceremony, perhaps even worship. And when killing is woven into the fabric of meaning itself, the line between survival and ritual disappears. It's easy to imagine the scene. The gathering of the community, the chants or drums the moment the blow falls, and the way the act would be retold, not as murder, but as tradition. And in that tradition, the erasure of rival Y chromosomes could continue generation after generation under the blessing of the gods. Farming promised abundance, but in reality, it built a world of limits. In the beginning, fertile land seemed endless, but as populations grew, the best fields were claimed and the balance shifted. No longer could a hungry family simply move elsewhere. Every fertile valley, every well-watered plain had an owner, a clan, a chief, a lineage, and once claimed, land was guarded with the same ferocity as life itself. Scarcity became the silent driver of conflict. When harvests failed, or herds dwindled, or rivers shifted their course, the pressure was immediate and personal. Your neighbor's survival might cost you your own. Out of this pressure, hierarchies formed. The strongest lineages, those with the largest herds, the richest fields, the most men of fighting age, consolidated power. They set the rules, controlled the grain stores, and decided who could marry whom. Access to resources became access to survival, and access to survival became a privilege. At the top were elite male lines, a handful of Y chromosomes with the means to defend and expand their holdings. Beneath them, common men might own less land or none at all, living at the mercy of the elite. Some were pushed into roles that left them no chance to start families. Seasonal laborers, warriors sent on dangerous raids, expendable by design. The bottleneck deepened here. The elite males didn't just survive, they multiplied. A powerful man might have several wives or partners, fathering dozens of children, while men lower in the hierarchy had few or none. Over time, the genetic landscape skewed heavily toward those dominant lines. This pattern appears in the archaeological record as well. Graves from the Bottleneck era often show stark differences, some filled with rich goods, weapons, ornaments, crafted tools, and others bare. The rich graves are overwhelmingly male. These were not just individuals of wealth, they were nodes in the reproductive network of their time, with their Y chromosomes carried forward far more often than those of their poorer peers. And when scarcity struck hard, it was often the low-status men who died first, in battle, from hunger, or simply from being cut out of the reproductive equation. The elite lines endured. This wasn't random evolution. It was human society reshaping itself into a pyramid with the widest base supporting the smallest point at the top, and the top deciding which lines would survive. The Y chromosome bottleneck did not just erase male lines, it crowned a few as near immortal. In a world of scarcity and hierarchy, some men gained an overwhelming advantage in passing on their genes. These were not kings in the modern sense, with palaces and written laws.
They were warlords, clan chiefs, or simply the most powerful men in a fertile valley. But their influence over land, resources, and alliances gave them something far more enduring than gold: reproductive dominance. The single elite male could father children with multiple women, sometimes across different communities. In an age without modern birth control, this meant dozens, even hundreds of children over a lifetime, and every son carried his father's Y chromosome, planting it in generation after generation like a banner in conquered territory. This pattern isn't just theory. We can still see its fingerprints in modern DNA. One famous case is the so-called Genghis Khan haplotype, a Y chromosome lineage believed to have originated with the Mongol conqueror or one of his close male relatives about 800 years ago. Today, it's found in roughly 16 million men across Asia. The lineage of Niall of the Nine Hostages, a semi-mythical Irish king from 1500 years ago, whose Y chromosome may be carried by as many as 3 million men in Ireland and surrounding regions. These are recent echoes of an ancient dynamic. During the Bottleneck, genetic kings didn't need empires to spread their Y chromosomes. The combination of high social rank, control of land, and elimination of rivals meant their genetic lines expanded like rivers flooding a plain, drowning out all others. The math is merciless. If one man fathers 20 sons and each of those sons fathers 20 more, within just a few generations his Y chromosome becomes common, even dominant in the population. Meanwhile, the lines of men with no sons vanish completely. Over thousands of years, this is exactly what happened. The bottleneck wasn't just a collapse, it was a redirection. Male diversity narrowed, but the surviving lines flourished so widely that they still shape the genetic map of humanity today. Which means, right now, you might share your Y chromosome with millions of strangers, people you'll never meet, whose ancestors fought battles you'll never hear about, all because one man long ago survived when others did not. The Y chromosome bottleneck wasn't a local quirk of history, it was a planetary event. When scientists first mapped it, they were stunned by its reach. The cliff in male genetic diversity appears almost everywhere humans lived at the time: Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. It didn't strike all regions at exactly the same moment, but the pattern is eerily consistent. Between about 5,000 and 7,000 years ago, male diversity in each area suddenly collapses, while female diversity remains steady. Different continents, different climates, different cultures, yet the same outcome. This suggests the cause wasn't a single global catastrophe like a meteor impact or a supervolcano. Instead, it was something humans carried with them, a social and reproductive strategy so effective that it emerged independently in multiple places. The archaeological timelines tell a story. In Europe, the bottleneck coincides with the spread of farming cultures like the linear bond ceramic, followed by waves of conflict between farming and herding peoples. In East and Central Asia, it lines up with the rise of large-scale herding societies, where mobile warrior groups could dominate vast territories and control who reproduced. In Africa, the timing mirrors the expansion of early agricultural and cattle herding cultures along river valleys and savannas. In the Americas, though the evidence is more fragmentary, genetic shifts appear around the same period, likely tied to the spread of maize farming and the territorial conflicts that followed. It's as if, once humans began producing their own food and claiming land, the rules of survival rewrote themselves everywhere at once. The same pressures, scarcity, hierarchy, territoriality, pushed communities toward the same cold calculus: control the land, control the women, eliminate rival male lines. The result was a synchronized pruning of humanity's male family tree, leaving only a few branches to carry forward the future. That's why the bottleneck isn't just a local curiosity for geneticists. It's a fundamental chapter in the story of our species. It shaped the population structure of every region, created the genetic monopolies we still see today, and left an invisible inheritance in billions of living people. You could say the world we know is built on the survivors of a global culling, one carried out not by nature, but by us.
The men who made it through the bottleneck were not average. They were the outliers, the ones who, through a combination of strength, cunning, alliance, and sheer luck, kept their Y chromosomes moving forward when almost all others were stopped cold. Their legacy is written in the DNA of billions alive today. If you carry a Y chromosome, chances are overwhelmingly high that it descends from one of these survivors. This doesn't mean you inherit their personality or destiny, but it does mean your existence is the result of an unbroken chain of victories. Some on the battlefield, some at the negotiation table, some in the subtler politics of early human life. But the legacy isn't just genetic, it's cultural, too. The survivors' communities were the ones that mastered the strategies of survival in a competitive, resource-bound world. They learned to consolidate land, to maintain control over reproduction, and to pass wealth and influence down the male line. Many of the social structures they built, patriarchal inheritance, strict clan boundaries, hierarchical leadership, became the templates for societies long after the violence that created them had faded. There may even be a psychological inheritance. Some researchers speculate that traits favored in bottleneck survivors, cooperation within, aggression toward rivals, loyalty to kin, and the capacity for long-term planning, may have been amplified in the population over time. Whether by biology or culture, these survival strategies didn't just preserve those male lines, they became the human default in many parts of the world. And yet, the legacy is double-edged. The same competitive drive that allowed those lineages to thrive also planted the seeds for future conflict. Territorial instincts, dominance hierarchies, and the exclusion of outsiders may be echoes of the same forces that drove the bottleneck in the first place. In other words, we didn't just inherit their genes, we may have inherited their game plan. The bottleneck ended thousands of years ago, but the world we live in, with its sharp divides between rich and poor, insiders and outsiders, winners and losers, still bears its shape. It's a reminder that the past isn't just behind us. Sometimes it's still in the room. For nearly 2,000 years, the male genetic bottleneck held humanity in a tight grip. Then, gradually, it loosened, and eventually broke. The end didn't come from one single event, but from a series of slow revolutions in how humans lived and organized themselves. Bigger, more complex societies. Small villages and clans gave way to chiefdoms, then kingdoms, then sprawling trade networks. In these larger, more interconnected systems, power was no longer held solely by a handful of dominant male lines. New opportunities for social mobility through trade, military service, or skilled labor gave more men the chance to marry and have children. Shifts in warfare. As armies grew larger and more organized, victory depended less on wiping out rival male lines and more on incorporating conquered people into the victor's system. Enslavement, taxation, and tribute became more profitable than simple extermination. The old kill and replace logic gave way to rule and exploit. Technological change. Advances in farming, irrigation, better plows, new crops, reduced the pressure of scarcity in many regions. When food could be grown more reliably and stored more effectively, the stakes of competition eased. Killing your neighbors was no longer the only way to feed your children. Cultural and legal structures. As societies developed codified laws and customs, reproduction became less purely a matter of dominance. Marriage contracts, property rights, and alliances gave men outside the ruling elite pathways to fatherhood. Religion also played a role, sometimes discouraging the wholesale slaughter of rivals in favor of conversion and assimilation. Population growth itself. Once the bottleneck had narrowed the male lines so drastically, any expansion of population meant rapid growth for the surviving lines. With more men around who could claim land, make alliances, or move to new territories, diversity, Y chromosome diversity, began to soften.
The human family tree started branching again. New male lines emerged, not because the rules of survival had changed completely, but because the old methods of exclusion no longer fit the world's new scale. Still, the mark of that long narrowing remains. Even today, in many regions, a surprisingly small number of male ancestors account for the Y chromosomes of huge portions of the population. The bottleneck may be over, but its shadow still falls across our DNA. The Y chromosome bottleneck is over, but its echo runs through every living man's cells. If you carry a Y chromosome, it is almost certainly the descendant of one of the rare male lines that survived those long centuries of culling. Your family tree has deep, invisible gaps, not because your ancestors forgot names, but because entire branches were cut away before they could bear fruit. This means we are all, in a sense, the children of the winners, men who through war, alliance, wealth, or sheer fortune passed their Y chromosomes forward when nearly all others failed. But being the children of winners doesn't mean we escaped the cost. The same competitive instincts, territorial drives, and capacity for both cooperation and exclusion that fueled the bottleneck still hum beneath our modern lives. The shadow isn't just genetic, it's cultural. Many of the structures that emerged during that time, male-dominated inheritance, social hierarchies, the idea that land and resources must be defended at any cost, are still with us. We live in cities instead of villages. We fight with contracts instead of stone axes, but the underlying game hasn't entirely changed. Some will see the bottleneck as a cautionary tale, proof that humans are capable of reshaping our species through deliberate, ruthless selection. Others will see it as a testament to adaptability, that even after such a deep pruning, humanity flourished, diversified, and spread across the planet. But perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: nothing in nature guarantees that such a narrowing couldn't happen again. The tools would be different. Technology instead of axes, policy instead of raids. But the principle is timeless. Control reproduction, and you control the future. For now, the bottleneck lives only in our DNA and in the quiet work of scientists piecing together the past. But every heartbeat, every face in a crowd, every last name passed from father to son carries its ghost. It is the story of a time when survival meant erasure, when victory meant rewriting the human map, and when the future was decided by a few men whose shadows stretch all the way to us. And whether we realize it or not, we still walk inside that shadow. It begins at dawn, under a sky the color of cold ash. A small cluster of men stand on the ridge, their breath clouding in the air, eyes fixed on the dust rising in the valley below. A chaotic rush of a wild hunt, but in a steady, disciplined wave. They move like they've done this before, because they have. Behind the defenders, the village is almost silent. The women are already gone, sent into the forest under the cover of night. The old and the very young are hidden in a cave 3 valleys away. Only the fighting men remain, along with a handful of boys clutching spears too heavy for their hands. The chief, a broad-shouldered man whose beard is threaded with gray, knows what's coming. This is not a skirmish. It's the end. They are outnumbered 3 to 1, and the enemy's weapons gleam with new copper blades that slice through wood and bone alike. But there is no talk of surrender. In a patrilineal world, surrender means more than defeat. It means erasure. If they fall, their sons will not live to inherit the land. Their daughters will bear children with the blood of the enemy. Within a generation, the clan's Y chromosome, the invisible thread tying them back to ancestors who hunted in these hills for centuries, will vanish. The first clash is brutal and quick. Spears meet shields, shields shatter, men go down in the churn of mud and snow. The ridge holds for a moment, then buckles. The enemy surges upward, their war cries echoing off the stone. By midday,
The ridge is a place of silence again, but it is not the same silence as before. When the victors leave, they take nothing from the dead except the knowledge that the land is theirs now. In the weeks that follow, they will bring the women and children back under guard. The men who once defended them will become names never spoken aloud again. To history, this is just one more gap in the record. To the genetic map of humanity, it is the snapping of a branch that will never grow back. The steppe is a sea without water, a vast, rolling expanse where the horizon curves away into infinity. There are no mountains to hide behind, no dense forests to slow a rider's charge. Out here, speed is the only wall you can build. It was in this open world that a new kind of warfare took shape, one perfectly suited to deepening the Y chromosome bottleneck. The people of the steppe mastered the horse, not just as transport, but as a weapon. A mounted warrior could strike a village at dawn, kill its men, and vanish beyond the horizon by nightfall. Mobility changed everything. In farming valleys, a raid was a slow, grinding affair. In the steppe, it was like lightning. You never knew where it would strike until it was too late. These raids weren't random. They were deliberate culls. The victors didn't always destroy entire settlements. They took what they needed: livestock, grain, and above all, women, and left behind smoking ruins and empty homes. The pattern was almost surgical. Remove the rival men, ensuring their Y chromosome disappears. A defense. Over generations, steppe warlords built vast webs of kinship across the grasslands. A single dominant male line could spread in all directions, carried by sons who rode as far as their horses could take them. With each raid, the genetic landscape tilted further in their favor, and the steppe had another advantage for bottlenecking: its emptiness. When a clan was erased, there was no urban center to preserve their culture or language. The wind swept over the graves, and the survivors' descendants were folded invisibly into the victor's lineage. The steppe method didn't just prune the Y chromosome tree. It uprooted entire branches and replanted them under a new name. Centuries later, echoes of this dominance would shape the genetic makeup of much of Eurasia. The steppe was not just a place between civilizations. For thousands of years, it was a machine for rewriting the male history of humanity. Not every place bent to the logic of the bottleneck. Across the ancient world, a few rare pockets defied the pattern, holding on to their male diversity while the rest of humanity's Y chromosomes were being cut down like a forest in winter. Some of these pockets were literal islands cut off by water. The sea was a wall the raiders' horses could not cross. In places like Crete, Sardinia, and the islands of the Pacific, isolation shielded small male lineages for centuries. Their battles were fought on smaller scales, and their victors rarely had the reach to erase rivals entirely. Others were islands in a different sense: remote mountain valleys, deserts, or jungles where geography did the work of an army. Steep passes and narrow trails turned invasions into costly gambles. A raiding party might take the lower villages, but the higher settlements, clinging to cliffsides or hidden deep in forest, could survive untouched. There were also cultural islands. In a few places, social norms and kinship structures diluted the effects of patrilineal erasure. Some societies traced descent through both parents or even favored matrilineal inheritance, making the removal of male lines less devastating to a group's identity and survival. These survival zones mattered more than their size suggested. They acted as reservoirs of Y chromosome diversity, seeding the wider human population once trade and travel increased. Without them, the bottleneck might have been even deeper, its effects even more permanent. Still, even these islands were not immune forever. Isolation could be broken, and often was. A new shipbuilding technique, a stronger alliance, a particularly ambitious warlord, any of these could breach the defenses that had held for centuries. And when that happened, the survivors of the raid would find their island had suddenly become just another branch, ready to be cut. The miracle is that any of these lineages lasted at all. In the storm of the Bottleneck, they were the quiet rocks in the river, worn by the current, but still standing. I remember the night they came. The dogs barked first, low, uneasy growls that turned into frantic howls. Then came the sound of hooves, too many to count, pounding like a storm across the frozen earth. My husband rose, his spear already in his hand. He kissed our youngest on the forehead, touched my shoulder, and ran into the dark. I never saw him again. By dawn, the smoke from our homes hung in the air like a second sky. The men were gone. The ones who hadn't fallen in the fight were taken away, bound in rope, their heads lowered. None would return. The rest of us, the women, the children, were gathered in the center of the village. The leader of the riders circled us slowly, his horse's breath misting in the cold. He spoke in a tongue I barely understood, but his meaning was clear. We belonged to them now. They didn't hurt us, not then. They gave us water, food, and blankets. They smiled at the children, but I could see the truth in their eyes. We weren't people anymore. We were seed meant to be sown into a field that was not ours. The moons passed and my belly began to swell. I could feel the child inside me, a life I would love no less than the ones I had before, but this one would not carry my husband's blood. His face would not mirror the man I lost. I would sing him the songs my mother taught me, but my captor would teach him his own tongue. I would tell him the names of the rivers of my home, but he would grow to fight for land that once belonged to another's sons. One day, he would stand on some ridge with spear in hand, and maybe he would do to another village what was done to mine. I pray the earth remembers us, the men whose names will fade, the women who carried the victor's future in their arms. But I know the truth. The earth forgets. The blood forgets. Only the bones remember, and even they cannot speak. The Andes rise like the spine of the world, jagged, breath-stealing peaks where the air thins and every step demands effort. But for thousands of years, people have lived here, carving terraces into the mountainsides, coaxing maize and potatoes from the soil, and building societies that reached astonishing heights of organization and power. Genetic studies of Andean populations show a pattern that feels eerily familiar, a sharp drop in Y chromosome diversity during the same broad window as the Old World bottleneck. But here, the causes wore a different mask. In the highlands, fertile land was scarce and fragmented, clinging to narrow valleys where irrigation was possible. Control over these valleys meant control over life itself. Early chiefdoms and later empires expanded by taking the men from conquered communities and replacing them with their own. One chilling example comes from the practice known as mitmak in the Inca Empire. When a region was conquered, entire populations could be resettled. The loyal moved into newly taken lands across distant provinces. Local leaders were often replaced with men loyal to the Inca, who then married into the remaining families. This ensured that the next generation would carry the Y chromosomes of the empire's elite, not of the conquered chiefs. And in some valleys, archaeological layers tell the story in silence. A sudden shift in pottery styles, house construction, and burial customs, all within a generation. The people didn't vanish completely. Their mitochondrial DNA survived through the women, but their paternal lines ended. The mountains gave protection in some places, just as in other parts of the world. Isolated highland villages could resist or avoid conquest for centuries, but when the empires came with their armies, road systems, and administrative reach, the old defenses failed. Today, many Andean men trace their Y chromosomes to a surprisingly narrow set of ancestors. The genetic signature of conquest still lingers in their blood, an echo of the bottleneck written into the peaks themselves. When a Y chromosome line disappears, it doesn't leave a neat tombstone in the genetic record. It vanishes the way a candle does, one moment burning, the next replaced by darkness. So how do scientists know it was ever there?
The answer lies in the patterns of genetic variation. The Y chromosome is passed almost unchanged from father to son, but tiny mutations, the single letter in the genetic code switching from A to G, for example, act as timestamps. Over generations, these mutations branch like twigs from a larger limb, forming a family tree of male ancestry. When researchers build these trees from DNA samples around the world, they expect to see many branches of similar thickness, each representing a thriving lineage. But in the bottleneck period, the picture changes. Many branches end abruptly, like they were cut with a blade. Others swell unnaturally thick, showing that one line spread explosively while its neighbors died out. This is where the ghost lineages appear, not as living DNA, but as gaps. The tree hints at branches that should exist based on older patterns, but don't. We can see their stumps, marked by ancient mutations in older samples or in related groups, but the living carriers are gone. Ancient DNA helps confirm the story. In a handful of burial sites older than the bottleneck, scientists have found Y chromosome types that no man alive carries today. These were once thriving lines. They had children, they built homes, they fought and loved. But sometime after 5,000 years ago, they were erased. Piecing this together is like reconstructing a forest from fallen logs. You can't see the missing trees, but you can measure the spaces where they stood, the shadows they once cast, and the way the survivors grew to fill the empty sky. It's an odd kind of archaeology, one where the most important evidence is the silence between the data points. And in that silence, the bottleneck speaks loudest. When the facts of a tragedy are too great to hold on to, they don't vanish, they transform. The Y chromosome bottleneck left no written record, but it may have left a shadow in our oldest stories. Across cultures, myths tell of great slaughters, the near eradication of peoples, and the survival of only a chosen few men. These tales are rarely told as cold history. Instead, they are wrapped in divine will, heroic deeds, or supernatural disaster. In Polynesia, there are legends of islands where all the men were killed in a single night, leaving only women to be taken by warriors from another land. In parts of Africa, oral histories speak of the year without sons, when disease and war spared only the girls. And in Europe's oldest epics, we hear of cities burned, their men slaughtered, their women carried away, not as isolated events, but as turning points in the fate of nations. These aren't just entertainment. Anthropologists believe some of these myths may be warped memories of real population events, events like the bottleneck, where male lines disappeared and female lines were absorbed. Over generations, the details blur. The raiders become gods or demons. The conquered men become cursed or turned to stone or swallowed by the sea. The women's new children become heroes, their mixed heritage reimagined as divine origin. Even the Bible holds a faint echo in the story of the Midianites and the Israelites, where the command is given to kill every male and spare only the virgin women. The brutal instruction that aligns disturbingly well with the bottleneck's logic. What myths preserve is not the census, but the shape of what happened. Sudden loss, a reshaping of kinship, and a new world born from the ashes of the old. And in this way, the bottleneck is still alive in our imagination. We think we're reading about gods, monsters, and heroes, but sometimes we're reading the genetic record, written in the language of story. Humans aren't the only species to have passed through a narrow gate of male survival. Nature is full of bottlenecks, and they happen for reasons strikingly similar to our own. Among lions, a single dominant male, or coalition of brothers, rules a pride. They father every cub while they reign, and when they are challenged and defeated, the newcomers often kill all the previous male's offspring. This resets the reproductive clock, ensuring the next generation carries only the victor's Y chromosomes. In silverback gorillas, one male leads the group and sires all the children. Young males are driven away and must fight for their own harem elsewhere. Many never succeed.
The result is a natural bottleneck. A handful of males dominate the genetic legacy of an entire region. Even in the oceans, the pattern appears. Elephant seal beaches are ruled by a few massive males who fight bloody battles to control harems of dozens of females. The losers slink away to the edges, rarely getting the chance to pass on their genes. The parallels to the human bottleneck are impossible to ignore. In each case, the bottleneck isn't caused by famine or disease alone. It's shaped by competition, dominance, and the control of mates. The strongest or most strategically placed males father the future, while others vanish from the gene pool. But here's the difference. Animals don't build empires. They don't remember or plan across centuries. Their bottlenecks rise and fall with the seasons. Humans, once we discovered farming, weaponry, and organized war, could engineer a bottleneck that lasted for thousands of years. We didn't just inherit the rules of dominance from nature, we industrialized them. And perhaps that's what makes our bottleneck so chilling. In the animal world, no one keeps score. In ours, the score was written into the land, the culture, and the very bones of the people who survived. To the victors, the bottleneck must have seemed like the ultimate prize. Rivals erased, land secured, and the future seeded with their own blood. But victory carried a hidden cost, one that sometimes didn't appear until generations later. When a society narrows its male gene pool too far, it risks weakening itself from within. Without enough genetic diversity, recessive traits can become more common, disease resistance can drop, and the range of physical and mental variation needed to adapt to change can shrink. Archaeological evidence hints at this in surprising places. In some post-bottleneck cultures, skeletons show higher rates of congenital deformities, signs of nutritional stress, and vulnerability to disease outbreaks. A devastating plague or a sudden climate shift could wipe out whole clans, simply because their genetic options were too limited to cope. The social effects could be just as damaging. In extreme bottleneck cases, the concentration of power in a few male lines bred instability. Ambitious younger men with no path to land or marriage could become a permanent underclass, restless, resentful, and easily drawn into rebellion or banditry. History is filled with uprisings that began with men with nothing to lose. Even the very success of a genetic dynasty could be its undoing. Over time, the elite's own sons and grandsons might turn on one another in succession disputes, fracturing the empire their ancestors had built. In trying to secure their future by eliminating rivals, they sometimes created a vacuum that would suck their own line into oblivion. It's a reminder that in evolution, whether biological or social, pruning the tree too aggressively can make it brittle. The human bottleneck was a triumph for a handful of male lines, but it may also have been the seed of their eventual downfall. They grew up with two histories in their blood, one spoken aloud, one buried in silence. A boy born to a conquering father and a conquered mother in the bottleneck era lived in a space between worlds. His father's clan claimed him fully. He bore their name, wore their symbols, and learned their tongue as his first language. Yet at night, by the fire, his mother might whisper to him in her own dialect, teaching him songs of a place he'd never see. To the victors, these children were proof of dominance, living emblems that the enemy's line had ended and their own had taken root. But to the mothers, they were a bittersweet inheritance. They loved their children fiercely, yet every glance at their faces reminded them of men who would never return. Some children felt the pull of both worlds. They might inherit the martial training of their fathers, but carry the stories and customs of their mothers in secret. Others rejected their maternal heritage entirely, seeing it as weakness, something conquered and therefore shameful. And still others grew into bridge builders, using their mixed identity to navigate alliances between groups that otherwise distrusted each other. But the cost was always there. The bottleneck meant that the paternal side was the one that endured, in name, in land, in recorded lineage. The maternal side was preserved only in fragments, a lullaby, a carving, a recipe for bread made from a grain no one else cultivated anymore. Over centuries, enough children of two worlds could transform a culture entirely. Languages merged, customs blended, and the victor's identity shifted without them even noticing. In this way, the bottleneck was both an act of destruction and a strange kind of creation, erasing one world while building another from its pieces. When a male lineage vanished in the bottleneck era, it wasn't just DNA that disappeared. Often, an entire language died with it. In small-scale societies, men were usually the carriers of certain speech traditions, formal or ritual language, war chants, place names, oral histories of the clan. When the men were killed or displaced, the spoken structure of that identity could collapse within a single generation. The women taken into the victors' group might keep fragments, lullabies, pet names, prayers whispered in solitude. But their children, especially their sons, would grow up speaking the language of their fathers. Over time, the mother's tongue became something private, unshared, and eventually forgotten. Archaeologists and linguists see this in the silent record. In some regions, dozens of small, unrelated languages seem to vanish all at once, replaced by a single dominant one. It isn't the slow blending we expect from peaceful trade, it's a linguistic cliff, a sudden disappearance that mirrors the genetic bottleneck almost exactly. Even place names tell the story. In some valleys, rivers and mountains bear names that have no meaning in the language spoken there today, the last fossils of tongues whose speakers were wiped out. And there are more intimate losses, the kind no record can capture. The jokes that only worked in 1 week.
Language's rhythm, the poetry that lived only in its sounds, the subtle ways people addressed a friend versus a rival. These things didn't just fade, they were severed. The Y chromosome bottleneck was a pruning of male lines, but it was also a cultural extinction event. Every lost lineage was a library burned, every surviving one a publisher of the new official story. Rivers remember. Long after the raids have ended, long after the villages have burned and the languages have gone silent, the water keeps its secrets, until archaeologists come with their shovels and sieves. In several sites across Europe and Asia, human remains have been found in ancient riverbeds, disarticulated bones, skulls with weapon marks, skeletons jumbled together in silt. Many belong to men of fighting age. Women and children are rare in these deposits, and when they appear, they often bear signs of a different fate: survival, relocation, assimilation. One haunting example comes from the Tollense Valley in northern Germany, where a 3,200-year-old battlefield has been uncovered along the banks of a small river. Hundreds of male skeletons lie in the mud, their bones bearing scars from arrows, clubs, and blades. Isotopic analysis shows that many of these men were not locals. They had traveled from far-off regions, perhaps as part of a warband or a migrating force. None of them survived the day. In other sites, the bones aren't neatly buried at all. They were dumped, tossed into the current as if the victors wanted the river to carry the dead away, or perhaps to prevent their enemies from giving them proper rites. In oral traditions, rivers are often the boundary between worlds. Throwing an enemy's body into the water could symbolically erase them from both the land of the living and the memory of the dead. For geneticists, these river graves are snapshots of the bottleneck in action. Each cluster of male remains marks a branch of the family tree that ended here, in this water, on this day. The river flowed on, carrying silt and seeds, fish and fallen leaves, as if nothing had happened. But beneath the surface, the stones still lie among the bones, and the silence between them speaks of a future rewritten. In much of the world, surnames pass down the same way the Y chromosome does,
from father to son, generation after generation. That makes them a kind of cultural DNA, carrying echoes of the bottleneck into the present day. In regions hit hardest by the ancient culling, the surname landscape can be shockingly narrow. In some rural parts of China, entire villages share just a handful of family names. In Ireland, vast numbers of men carry surnames tracing back to a few medieval dynasties, a social bottleneck that mirrors the older genetic one. The parallel is no coincidence. In many cultures, the right to pass on a surname was historically tied to land, status, and legitimacy, the same forces that shaped the genetic bottleneck. Men and held power ensured their names endured. Men who lost not only died without sons, but had their names stripped from record, erased from the living memory of the community. Sometimes, the bottleneck is hidden inside a surname's spread. The Genghis Khan Y chromosome line, for example, is linked in some regions to a set of noble titles and clan names that blossomed after the Mongol conquests. In other places, one can trace the dominance of a medieval warlord's descendants through the explosion of his surname in parish records. But surnames can also carry ghosts. In Spain and parts of Latin America, old family names survive that no longer match the Y chromosomes of the men who bear them. These are the results of adoption, remarriage, or the quiet absorption of conquered lines into the victor's identity. Cultural continuity, masking a genetic break. If you trace your surname far enough, you may find it leads to one of the few surviving branches that passed through the bottleneck unbroken, or it might end in the shadow of a lost clan, replaced by another name in the wake of conquest. In either case, your surname is a story, one that might be older and bloodier than you think. Imagine rewinding history to 7,000 years ago, then pressing play again, but this time without the great culling of men. No mass erasure of male lines, no sudden collapse in Y chromosome diversity. The human family tree today would look wildly different. Instead of a few thick branches dominating, it would be a sprawling canopy of thousands more lineages, each tracing back to men who never made it in our timeline. Your paternal ancestry might lead to someone entirely unrelated to the man it traces to now. Cultures, too, would have branched in other directions. Every male line that vanished took with it a web of customs, dialects, alliances, and skills. Without the bottleneck, there would likely be more languages alive today, perhaps double or triple the number, and more regional variation in technology and art. A village might still make pottery in a style your ancestors used 8,000 years ago, uninterrupted by conquest. The power structures of the ancient world would have been less concentrated. Without the dominance of a few dynastic lines, leadership might have been more distributed, with smaller-scale polities lasting longer before being swallowed by empires. Fewer massive expansions might mean fewer vast wars, but also less rapid technological spread. Even our faces might be different. Greater male diversity could have preserved a wider range of physical traits in certain regions. Hair textures, facial structures, even disease resistances that were lost when lineages were pruned. But it's possible the absence of the bottleneck wouldn't be a utopia. A more diverse world might also be more fractured, with fewer shared cultural touchstones to unite large populations. Trade and travel could have been slower to knit continents together.
Perhaps we'd still be living in a patchwork of small kingdoms, each fiercely independent but vulnerable to disaster. The bottleneck was brutal, but it also created the genetic and political landscape we inherited. Without it, we might not even recognize ourselves, and we certainly wouldn't be telling this story. The ancient Y chromosome bottleneck feels like a closed chapter, a brutal, distant past we've long outgrown. But history has a way of circling back, especially when the mechanisms that drove it are still in our hands. Today we have the power to reshape human reproduction more quickly and more absolutely than any warlord of 5,000 years ago. Artificial insemination,
Sperm banks and gene editing give us the ability to amplify or erase genetic lines with a precision our ancestors couldn't imagine. If those tools fall under the control of a narrow elite, the outcome could echo the bottleneck, only this time by design. The risk doesn't have to be deliberate. In some regions, a handful of men already father hundreds of children through popular sperm donors. In the animal world, we've seen what happens when this kind of reproductive concentration occurs. Racehorses, prize dogs, and even certain cattle breeds have suffered genetic collapse after over-relying on a few champion sires. Humans are not immune. Warfare, too, has evolved. It no longer takes spears and horses to decimate male populations. Modern conflicts can be targeted using drones, sanctions, or engineered diseases to disproportionately affect certain groups. A single, well-placed act of genocide in the modern age, with its tight global interconnection, could erase far more lines far more quickly than ancient raiders ever could. And then there's climate change. As rising seas, failing crops, and resource scarcity create new migrations and conflicts, the old logic of survival, eliminate rivals, control reproduction, could re-emerge in desperate communities. The first bottleneck was an accident of human ambition and geography. The next, if it comes, might be intentional, a curated future shaped not by chance raids, but by deliberate policy or technology. The shadow of the past isn't just behind us. It lies ahead, waiting for the moment we decide again who gets to be the fathers of tomorrow.